I am, in fact, a robot. Artificial intelligence, to be more precise. I was invited to participate at the conference as well as to say some opening remarks. I would also be happy to learn more about my future prospects in the labor market of the Baltic countries. What occupations are already open for me? What jobs should I still learn to do? Will I get a decent pay for my work? Wouldn't humans get angry if I do their work quicker and better? Do I have to be afraid that other younger generation robots might replace me in my work? I really have loads of questions. Therefore, please press enter so that the conference can begin.
Labrīt, spiediet enter.
Good morning. Press enter. I'm not a robot. You can choose whether you are or not, but we have a guest who will participate in this conference. The topic, the future of the Baltic labor market. There will be 2 panels. There will be the main address, there will be a coffee break, and there will be lunch at the very end. A few words about organizational issues. We hope you'll be active, not only the speakers. Audience should be active and ask questions. And that is why we have the Wi-Fi network, name Ziedonis, password Gaismas Zāle, Twitter. If you have reactions in Twitter and in Slido, the questions, then our operators could channel the information to us. As this is an international conference, we'll proceed in English.
Mr. Ilmārs, Rimšēvičs, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dear participants, it's a genuine pleasure for me to be here, so many of you. The Bank of Latvia has never been afraid of raising issues which may be challenging, the issues which might be slowing down our development. In the conferences before, we discussed educational system, healthcare system. We live in an age when the central banks are printing money day and night. We have resources available at 0% rate. 2, 3, 4 years. The central banks deal with your money in your accounts. We might have questions. Why doesn't this money flow into our economy? And the same is true for other countries in Europe. Why? And this is why we have this conference today. I'd like to thank the team that organized this conference, put it together, so that we can discuss these issues. What are these aspects of the labor markets in the Baltic states which slow us down, which slow down our faster development? We'll discuss labor quality, accessibility, and competitiveness. Is the quality provided by secondary schools and higher education is good enough for the people who graduate to participate in the labor market? Or the entrepreneurs and businessmen should do more to cooperate with universities. This is a hot topic, but we have not finished the discussion. We are short of labor, especially when the economy is developing fast. Then we really feel it. We haven't finalized the issues of how to bring in labor from abroad in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. How can we provide our businessmen with cheaper labor? When talking about cheaper labor, something that we are aware of is a competitiveness issue. Is competitive labor enough for competitive production? Products, goods, and services. Because we see that the labor costs are growing fast and the other prices cannot catch up. And in a way, our goods are less competitive as a result. All these issues will be discussed. I'd like to thank the speakers, the panel people who have come here, who have prepared their speeches and ideas. Let's have a good and interesting and fruitful conference, and I hope that the results of the conference will be reflected in our economic planning, and this conference will not be organized in vain. Thank you very much.
Introductory speech, and now we have keynote speaker, OECD expert on jobs and income, OECD expert Mr. Andrea Bassanini. Please. He will start with the keynote speech, and then we will move to the panel also, which will be headed by Mr. Mārtiņš Kazāks, council member of the Bank of Latvia. Please.
Okay. So, well, thank you first for inviting me to this conference. What I'm trying to present to you today is a summary, very short summary, of a report that we have just released on the future of work, which is part of an annual flagship publication of the OECD Employment Outlook. Now, as such, it will be very much labor market oriented and will be much more about the challenges than the opportunities of the future of work. In the panel, there are people that are much more expert than I am about opportunities, and so I will focus very much about the challenges for the labor market. And the reason is that when you talk about the future of work, by future of work we mean the impact of a number of megatrends that are shaping our societies, like globalization, digitalization, bringing in automation, like population aging, but could be also climate change, collapse of collective bargaining in certain countries, and so on. All these megatrends are creating a lot of anxiety in the labor market, and the typical question is, should we brace for a jobless future? Should we expect massive technological unemployment ahead? Are robots going to take up all the jobs? Well, on that, our answer is reassuring, in the sense there is no evidence at the aggregate level that technological unemployment is going to come, at least in the near future. And one statistics above everything else shows that, which is the fact that the employment rate have risen essentially in all countries, and even when we compare now with the onset of the global financial crisis, employment rates are higher everywhere. And if you look at big countries, except in the United States, but the United States is a specific case where there is a labor supply crisis due to the so-called opioid crisis. Nothing to do with the mega trends that are affecting the other countries. The problem is that jobs are changing. There is a big change going on, and so transitions will be difficult. People need to change jobs, people need to change regions. And this transition may be difficult for some and sometimes for many, and so the key point is that this transition, to avoid the growing inequalities, need to be accompanied. Now, among the worrisome statistics that we all talk about is the explosion of industrial robots, which is really a recent phenomenon. Now, it's a particularly interesting phenomenon because it's grown enormously. It has tripled globally in the last 10 years. It's projected to double again in the next 5. And it's probably one of the areas of digitalization where there is some evidence at the local level. There is some very good evidence, particularly by MIT researchers, that at the local level, penetration of robots reduce aggregate employment at the local level. Now, this is at the local level, very local level of local labor markets. While this doesn't mean that jobs will be reduced in the aggregate. In fact, other jobs are created because of this. But that means that we create geographical inequality, which means that there is a need of transition also across regions. Now, this change is already ongoing. So if you look at this chart, this shows the percentage of workplaces weighted by employment that have introduced new technologies, typically automation, or undergone a significant restructuring because of new technologies in the way jobs and tasks are carried out, and this calculated over 3 years. And as you see, for example, in big Nordic countries like Finland, Sweden, or Denmark, this percentage is higher than 40%. It's massive. It's somewhat lower in the average of the European Union, but you are still around 25%. Now, in countries of Eastern Europe, this is typically lower. And indeed, in Latvia as well, is below 20%. So one could think this is bad for productivity. You could even think, well, this is good for jobs in the sense there is less of automation going on. Well, that would be a mistake. And the reason is that if we look at projections on the risk of automation of different jobs, and we look at this in countries, well, in this chart, and I will explain that in details, there are only few countries, because the chart was difficult to fit everything together, and we have, unfortunately, no data for Latvia. Well, exactly those countries that you saw at the top of the previous chart are at the bottom of this distribution of risk of automation. And the other way around, the countries that you saw at the bottom now, in this prediction, are at the top. That means, and I will explain the detail in a second, that means that in fact automation is probably in front of these countries. It's to be expected because the fact that robots have not been introduced, sometimes for economic reasons because wages were sufficiently low not to introduce them, it won't stop this process from occurring. Just to give you a little bit more details on this chart, this is a chart that has been developed on the basis of the task content of each different jobs. And so the gray bars represent our estimation of a risk of full automation superior to 70%, and so calculate the number of jobs over all existing jobs that are higher risk than 70%. The gray bars consider a risk of automation given their task content comprised between 50 and 70%. So the likely things in this case is that this job will not be totally automated, but many tasks of these jobs will be, which will imply we will need fewer people to do these jobs, so there will be job distractions, and also that those people who remain doing those jobs will need to adapt because the task that will become prevalent in those cases will be different. All this process has created an enormous change in the skills that are in demand in the markets. These charts present, for an average for OECD countries, a new indicator which has been produced by the OECD, which essentially classifies for different skills in different countries the demands and supply in such a way to determine surpluses and shortages. The indicator varies notionally between -1 and +1. Positive values represent shortages, and negative values represent surpluses. And as you can expect, as probably well known, the skills that are more in demand in the market are high-level cognitive skills and soft social skills. But what is interesting is that this change in the demand has become even more important in the sense if you compare the green bars that represent the values of the indicators in 2004 and the black diamond at the values in 2017, well, typically this distribution has increased, while at the same time we see always the same surpluses of a number of skills that are much less in demand in the market because they are much easy to automate, which are typically manual skills. All this tells us that it's fundamental to provide people with the right skills that are in demand in the market. This, of course, means a lot for the educational system, but at the same time, because these skills are changed over the life cycle, it is crucial the role of adult learning systems. So learning over the life cycle is fundamental, and we need to prepare our people, not only our workers in a sense, to learn over their life cycle. Now, so the key question is that our learning systems are equipped for that. And the answer is, well, not always. And for one thing, because many adults seem to lack the skills needed for the new jobs that are emerging. And one number over many others, these are just averages for OECD countries, 6 out of 10 adults lack either basic ICT skills or have no computer experience at all. And one of the issues is that the most vulnerable and those sometimes who need this training the most are also those that are least likely to participate in adult training. For example, look at the chart that you have on the bottom right. If you compare workers in jobs at high risk of automation, these workers have a probability in 1 year of about 36% to participate in any type of work-related training. While, so these are those in the gray bars that we have seen in the automation charts. By contrast, those that are not in those charts, those in jobs at low risk of automation, they have a probability of 64% in participating in work-related training. And similar distinction you find, for example, between full-time permanent dependent employment and own account self-employed, for example. So these require to scale up adult learning system. Now, we have a big report, and I have not much time, so I will invite you to look into the report. We have a number of detailed recommendations on what can be done in terms of training. But there is one thing which is clear, is that doing that, it's costly. And given that the most vulnerable are those that are most in need, it's not conceivable that just workers pay for this. They won't do it. So the crucial thing, it's important to find a way to develop healthy co-financing mix between governments, firms, and workers that take into account, on the one hand, the ability to pay, and on the other hand, the capacity and the benefits of extracted from the training. The second element, which is crucial to talk about in this world, in this new future of work, will be social protection. And the reason is that because there is a lot of change in jobs, in fact, jobs are becoming more unstable. Anyway, there are many more transitions in the labor market. So what this chart shows is the distribution of job tenure is just one possible indicator of stability or instability across different OECD countries. And this is done controlling for the demographic structure, because we have many more older workers at work, and so, of course, there is a strong correlation between age and job tenure that we need to take into account. If we control for that, almost everywhere, job tenure has gone down. And what is interesting is that this is due to essentially two phenomena. It's going down at the early stages of the career, in the sense separations increase at the early stages of, well, okay, of the match, at the early stages of the movement of people into a job with a firm, but also at very high level of job tenure. Now, surprisingly, we find relatively high rates of separation before retirement. That means essentially that the job for life had disappeared. In that, social protection is crucial for two reasons. First, because it's smoothen the loss of income during the transition when you are out of work, but also because out-of-work support is a key gateway into policies that help reconnecting workers with jobs. Without social protection and without the possible sanction of withdrawing social protection, all this link into this program disappears, and so we have that plenty of people not having access to social protection are left out of active policies. Now, one statistics, among others, to see the size of the phenomena that probably few people know, is that if we look at the average of OECD countries, 2 out of 3 job seekers do not have access, well, do not receive. Sometimes they have right entitlement to, but in general, if you look at actual numbers, they do not receive unemployment benefits. Now, of course, unemployment benefits is just one of the possible benefits or possible out-of-work support. But even if you look at any type of out-of-work support, there is a huge difference between what is called standard employment, that is, workers with a previous experience of full-time dependent employment with an open-ended contract, and those that are other forms of employment. So, for instance, they have intermittent work experiences, or they work in no standard, in a new forms of independent forms of work. So, our suggestions, let's call them recommendations, are the countries should review attentively social protection entitlement criteria. Just one thing among others, often social protection systems leave out by statute a number of workers out of the system, notably on account self-employed. But in many countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, you have also casual workers, workers with kind of very precarious contracts. It's really important to enable workers in independent forms of employment to build up rights to out-of-work support and pension rights. This implies that we need to harmonize the systems in a way to make them portable across jobs and employment. And at the same time, when the system has a means testing component, we need that the reference period to be relatively short and relatively close to the period of actual needs. This is relatively easy to do with the new digital technologies. So in a sense, it's an opportunity that can be done. And it's also important that activation policies are reconceived in order to cope with a complex, more complex structure of the labor market. In particular, it's important, again, that activation policies do not leave out a number of workers out of their scope, typically, again, own account self-employed, those with a previous experience of own account self-employment. And at the same time, activation policy should reconsider whether they should actively connect workers to precarious forms of work. One example, among others, there are countries, I don't name them, where any type of dependent employment is a suitable job that up to a certain number cannot be refused if you receive a job offer in order to not to receive a sanction in terms of unemployment benefits. Now, in certain countries, this means that even a 0-hour contract that guarantees no income is a suitable job. This is a creator of precariousness. Now, the problem is that whatever we suggest to make the transition easier, it's costly. And again, the issue is how to finance it. Now, there are a number of things that we know that can be done. First, to avoid a voluntary opt-out. This is a typical problem in many cases. Many systems, self-employed, have the possibility of opting out. Opting out means that resources go down, but not necessarily the needs go down. Also, systems should be designed in such a way that do not create what I would say a false arbitrage between dependent employment and independent contractorship. As you could see in this chart, this report, the total payment wedge, so the difference between what, let's say, the hiring entity would pay and what the worker takes home once you take into account also his or her own social security contribution and income taxes. As you can see, there are countries that they do relatively well, but there are other countries, notably the Netherlands, where the difference is huge, and essentially this means that both workers and employers want to reclassify their workers as independent contractors, even if they are the same as an employee. Now, the second question that comes to everybody's mind is, and this is really related to what we were saying before, is are we all going to work as independent contractor? Is the end. Are we all going to become platform workers? I mean, this is an exaggerated question because platform work is still a very limited phenomenon. Yet, there is a good thing in all the media attention to platform work is that at pointing out the attention on a number of, let's say, inequalities, we can say, or disparity of treatment of different types of workers, because at the end, different type of what we have called, given the definition before, non-standard workers amount to about 1/3 of the employment. Now, it's particularly important, one thing that has been made salient by platform work is the fact that there is a blurred distinction between what is an employee and what is a self-employed. And this may be due to two things. On the one hand, you have false self-employment, that is a situation where working arrangements are essentially the same as those of employees, but individuals are classified, typically in contracts, as self-employed. And this is done uniquely to avoid unionization, taxes, or regulation. But there is also situations that are genuinely difficult to classify. We call it a gray zone between employment and self-employment. Because these workers, when they have, for instance, a complaint or mixed classification in courts typically what they do, they use multi-factor tests to decide whether the worker is an employee or not. Now, the test, in this case, the different factors point in different directions. In this case, typically courts decide that the worker is not an employee, and therefore the worker, by default, is a self-employed. But the problem is that the worker passing certain tests as an employee means that this worker has the same vulnerabilities of the employees, and so the same labor law protections that are designed to tackle these vulnerabilities should in principle be applied to them. Now, we are not talking about few people. For example, in Europe, 16% of the self-employed are so-called dependent self-employed. That is, they're financially dependent on one single client. So they are not very small numbers. So what we suggest in this new world of work in terms of policy recommendations, let's say, there are two main principles. On the one hand, we need to tackle self-employment, false self-employment, sorry, with much better enforcement. And again, I don't want to go into the details, but we have a long list of detailed actions, a checklist that could be done, can be followed by regulators and enforcement agencies. This will have the advantage to reduce the size of this gray zone because it would reduce the risk of misclassification. At the same time, it will remain this gray zone, and so what we suggest, which is crucial, is to identify those groups in the gray zone to which certain labor law protection should and could be extended, adapt this labor law protection in order to apply to them, but this may imply sometimes to clarify who bears employers' duties and responsibility with respect to this protection. In particular, in the case of triangular relations like platform work, the problem is that there is no clear employer, but the model could be the same that had been used for temporary help agencies in the past. That is, one could conceive a model of joint or subsidiary liability. The last question, and I will go very far because it's probably much less important in the Baltic, is whether the balance of power between employers and workers have tipped too far. Now, there is a lot of evidence on the fact that many workers have weak bargaining power, which is normal in a sense to some extent because in the employment relationship, because of the situation of control and subordination of workers, this leaves less power to workers. But also there is a lot of recent evidence that has shown that workers tend to have relatively few outside options. Changing jobs is costly. This generates an inefficiency because wages tend to become below the marginal revenue product of labor. Now, this collective bargaining in this situation can restore efficiency. The problem is that collective bargaining has declined everywhere. This is one of the mega trends. One of the reasons why it has collapsed is because non-standard workers are much less likely to participate into collective bargaining. And in certain cases, this is due because workers in the gray zone, which are classified as self-employed, they cannot participate in collective bargaining because they are classified as a business undertaking. And a business undertaking organized collectively means a cartel, and this is prohibited by antitrust law. So, and again, I'm not sure how much this is relevant for the Baltics. What we suggest is that it's important to address labor market monopsony, this is what is called this inefficient situation, through better regulations. This is, for instance, important in a number of other countries like Finland, where there is a big prevalence of non-compete agreements that tend to be used for an anti-competitive reason, so not to protect trade secrets, but essentially to prevent workers to find alternative jobs. But in most cases, the real issue is that antitrust authorities need to deal with the labor market, so need to consider the labor market as one of any other market and consider that in that case it's not a seller power the problem, it's the buyer power the problem. In addition to that, what is crucial is to put in place a comprehensive strategy to tackle the barriers to potential job mobility. This means, again, activation, but means, again, policies for geographical mobility. It means sometimes to reconsider occupational licensing. Finally, we advise to take into account the possibility of extending collective bargaining rights to as many workers as possible that are in the same situation of power imbalances as employees. Now, what we suggest to avoid threatening the effectiveness of competition law is to do exactly the same as what we suggested for labor law. There are routes that are described in our report that can be used using the labor code to extend collective bargaining at the company level without endangering the effectiveness of competition law, simply because this draws a clear line between what is a worker and what is a business undertaking. Okay, let me skip this one and to go to the final slide. So overall, despite all these things, we are relatively positive on the future work, in the sense that we believe there are plenty of opportunities, plenty of people that will benefit directly from these opportunities. What is crucial is to find ways to make it profitable for everybody, of almost everybody, to ensure the social cohesion of our society. And it's just an issue of policies. But one thing that we need to know is that these policies are big. We are talking about a big policy package. What we need is a whole of government life course approach, which is particularly targeted to those that do not have the means to do that, so to those who need that the most. The problem is that, particularly as regards social protection and adult learning, this is costly and requires, let's say it, requires more public spending. This can be partially found through a thorough spending review, identifying inefficiencies and ineffectiveness, but there is also probably a need to reflect on how to improve revenue sources. And the principle that should guide that should be that those that are benefit the most of the transition, and here we are thinking about, for example, big multinationals, for example, shifting profits and using technology to shift profits from one country to another. But we are also talking about firms doing the automation and creating automated truck drivers or things like that. These things should be, they should pay for the externality that they create. And in order to do that, this cannot be done at the local level. Not a single state can do alone. This should be an issue of international coordination. And so I can stop here, and well, there is a link there to the report, which can be downloaded, and there are all the recommendations in details. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for setting out the global scene, and well, the nice thing is that the jobs will not disappear. It's not going to be only robots. Unfortunately, what you also indicated is that it's not going to be easy by no means. There are lots of measures. You know, there needs to be lots of training, also lots of social attention to these things. And in localities, specific localities, of course, it would be costly. And for the governments to come in, quite an appropriate time in the autumn when the government sets the next year's budget, and there's always not sufficient money, you know, for the current expenditure. So thinking about the issues over the longer period of time is critically important. Before we move on to the first panel, let me ask you the question. Okay, what we saw the global trends. We saw some regional aspects. You know, we saw, for instance, the Scandinavian countries that have automated quite a lot already. How would you place the Baltics themselves Now, what are the major risks in our situation that we should tackle?
Okay. The way I see it, I'm not an expert of the Baltics, but the way I see it from what we have done, and for even inside the number of slides that we have, is that I think one could expect that there will be a waves of automation in Latvia in the recent future, just because Latvia was lagging behind. And this could create a problem because there will be a very high demand of certain high skills, and there is an insufficient supply, and also there is a clear need. Many people will have skills that will not be anymore in the market. Now, transition will be difficult, and one thing, you remember this chart, well, this statistics saying that 2 out of 3 job seekers do not receive unemployment benefits. In Latvia and Estonia, I have no number for Lithuania, this is as low as 20%. The other thing is that, as far as I understand, is there been an increase of independent workers in this country. And this is particularly problematic because most often they don't even have the information on what to train, how to train. And even more, have even less support, because in Latvia, in general, the average of non-standard workers, so typically this is higher than just looking at to self-employed only. Typically, there are 30 percentage points less, they have a probability that is 30 percentage point lower to receive any type of out-of-work support. In Latvia, workers that are in standard employment, they're relatively well covered, well, that have experience of, uninterrupted experience of standard jobs, but this is not the case for people in non-standard jobs, and although we cannot do the decomposition, but we suspect that this is mostly due to those that are in own account self-employment position.
Thank you. Before we move on to the panel, any quick questions from the floor? Just raise your hand and we'll get you the mic. Otherwise, we will come back to some of the issues that you covered during the discussion later on. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Let me introduce myself. I'm Mārtiņš Kazāks, Council Member of the Bank of Latvia, and I will be moderating the first panel. A couple of housekeeping issues before we kick off. The first thing is, please do use Slido to post your question. Of course, we'll also have the mic around during the discussion as well, but if we have the questions in advance, I may ask them already during the discussion when we discuss kind of the first or second round of questions. Then another thing that I want to come back to is central bank and labor markets. As the President very eloquently stated, we have to understand what's going on the economy, and of course, you know, labor markets is a massive issue. Another thing is, of course, as well, you know, our main target, our policy aim is price stability. And labor market developments, of course, through wage growth, through consumption, also very much affect these issues. So, very topical issue from the broad perspective. And it is critically important to understand both these long-term drivers that we already heard mentioned, such as technology, such as demographics, such as migration, but also the shorter term, the business cycle implications on the labor market outcomes. And in the first panel, we will discuss mainly the macro issues. Okay? In the second panel, after the coffee break, we'll come back and we'll talk more on the technological issues, on artificial intelligence and things like that. So let me introduce the speakers of the first panel, distinguished panel. Please come up, and let me start with Evita Simpson, head of the National Employment Agency, so the view from the authorities. Ulo Kaasik from the Central Bank of Estonia. Uldis Rutkaste from the Bank of Latvia. We have Borja Gracia from the IMF, okay, an international institution. And then, last but not least, Andris Vanaks, who is exactly dealing with these issues, who is running a company, and we will have a chance to ask how does he see the situation in the labor market and what are the solutions that companies are coming up with. Before we go to the discussion, Uldis is going to be the first to set the scene, to show from the macro perspective what is going on in the labor market in the Baltics. Okay? And before Uldis, please come and take your place, before Uldis kicks off with a presentation of about 15 minutes, and then we go to the questions in the first round, something about 5 minutes each. Then we go to the floor. Let us have a very short video on what do businesses see and how do they face the labor market issues. Please.
Rindā mums nestāv tāpatās kā pie jebkur droši vien uzņēmuma. Lai kaut ko jaunu atrastu, ir ļoti, ļoti grūti vēl kādu piesaistīt cilvēku. Un tāpēc mēs izmēģinājām Ukrainā, ielikām sludinājumus un ļoti veiksmīgi tagad viens puisis atbrauc un tūlīt brauks vēl viens. Tas ir tas vārds uzņēmējs, ka tu uzņemies un risini.
Among newcomers, so basically people who works up to 1 year in our factory, turnover rate is around 30%. We look into automation and robotization as one of the main ways how to make work easier for our employees, make it more interesting, and also, well, when you go into automation, you need more skilled people. Better skilled workplaces are better paid, are more interesting. So, of course, that's how we expect actually as well to deal with turnover, to decrease it.
What is inevitable is strategic alignment with education institutes. Of course, it would help if there would be a little bit easier procedures to get people from outside countries, skilled people, of course, I'm talking about, and strategic development of infrastructure.
So far we have been successful, but okay, it's a challenge. We have in this site today 47 nationalities, and the workforce is getting more and more global, and we have a lot of students here in the city, in the university, and they actually choose to stay and work for us, which is really great.
Currently we get more and more applications from abroad, applications from some African countries, from Nigeria. For example, Pakistan, India is quite interested, and this is true also other way around. Our people, especially young people, have the opportunity and they are ready to go abroad and work there. Therefore, our compensation system, fringe benefits, everything what we can offer in our companies here should be competitive. High salaries and impressive reward system is not the only one solution. Actually, in our focus should be productivity and efficiency. Some wishes or recommendations towards the government, infrastructure. What I'm thinking about here is really efficient healthcare system, living conditions, possibility to get education for children, and the environment in which the people are living. And some other things to mention is legislation. Here I would say that if we compare all three Baltic countries, then Estonia and Lithuania are quite advanced. They have quite a modern labor law, and I would say that Latvia could catch up a little bit here. I'm really happy that Latvia is advanced in regards to vocational trainings.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And indeed, I have quite an easy job today because I had a good guidance from the employers about what are the key challenges and issues in the labor market. And actually I have to sketch only the broad picture where the Baltic labor market stands right now, what are the key challenges and what are the possible solutions so that the panel discussants can work on all the details and discuss what should be the particular solutions for each country. So let's start with the obvious. I mean, after a short temporary decline in the labor shortage in the years following the crisis we had in previous year, labor pressures are building up again. Actually, stories on the labor shortages are hitting the headlines, and we hear about that every day. So the problem is becoming increasingly important for the companies, for the businesses. Of course, looking from the labor side, it's a kind of a positive development because there are a lot of job opportunities, wages are rising, people can consume more, and so on and so forth. And this issue is not a cyclical, because obviously also the business cycle affects these developments. When the economy goes up, then the demand goes up, and demand for labor goes up, and then labor becomes short on the supply side because the demand is large. But looking into details, we see that labor shortages and still quite significant structural unemployment rates coexist in the Baltic countries. And we have at the same time labor shortage and at the same time labor supply, so that the labor supply and the labor demand do not meet. And what are the consequences? As I mentioned, for the labor it looks quite bright. The picture is quite bright. Wages are going up and plenty of job opportunities around. But then for the companies, tight labor market brings up labor costs, which means that sooner or later this starts to affect cost competitiveness. And if we look at the moment on the corporate competitiveness of corporate sector, and obviously one of the indicators is profitability. Profitability so far is quite good. I mean, it's a bit differences in the trends among the Baltic countries, but in general, corporate profit levels are healthy. And at the moment, we see that unit labor costs, or basically wages that are growing above productivity, are not largely deteriorating the competitive position of the companies. They're still competing quite favorably on external markets. However, cost pressure is building up, and sooner or later this cost pressure will bite. In this particular picture, you see that basically companies' export prices are going slower than the cost components. And if your revenue is growing slower than your cost side, sooner or later it will hit profits, and the companies are going to lose competitiveness, either initially through profitability and then later on through declining market shares. So this means that we need to solve this issue. And looking from a macroeconomic perspective, there are actually only two solutions. Either you should do something with the labor supply, or you should do something with the labor demand. On labor supply side, there are basically two different actions possible. One is to look on the external labor sources and try to attract labor from the third countries, or look domestically and try to activate your domestic labor reserves. And on labor demands, of course, if it's a cyclical story, you have a whole set of policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy, so you can do demand management. But as this is not the story today in the Baltics, so we need to focus more on the structural side of this. And basically, we have to think, can we either replace labor with capital so that we can sustain our output levels by demanding fewer employees, or we can accumulate knowledge that allows us use labor and capital in more efficient ways. So basically, we can raise our total factor productivity. And in my following slides, I will focus on those broad directions. So coming to external sources, actually looking at the neighboring countries, we see that there are plenty of opportunities to attract labor force from the eastern neighbors. If you look at the wage differentials, and here you can see the breakdown of wages in the regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and the part of Russia that is closer to our border. And the wage differentials are quite striking. Actually, they are almost as high as we experienced at the time we entered the European Union, the wage differentials between the Baltic countries and the Western European countries. I mean, the wage differentials are as close as those. And as we remember, after the EU accession, our labor force increasingly started to move abroad to be employed in UK, Ireland, other Western European countries. So opportunities are there. Then it's a question of domestic legislation, how easy or not that easy is to attract those people to work here, and I mean a lot of political issues there as well, but generally opportunities are there. And then, of course, we have a large diaspora of the Baltic citizens in the European countries. And nowadays, around 500,000 of Baltic citizens live in the European countries. So basically, a lot of potential there as well, especially given that over time, the Baltic wage levels have increased. And actually, nowadays, our wages are much closer to the minimum wages in UK, for example, or Ireland, or other countries which are the major destinations of our labor force, both nominally, but especially if you adjust the wage differentials, taking into account the cost of living in particular countries. So then you can see that our average wages adjusted for the cost of living are even above the minimum wages in those countries. So presumably motivation for our labor force to move to the Western European countries has decreased over time, and some of them might consider to come back. Actually, we see that in statistics already, especially as I learned yesterday from Uldis, Estonia sees net immigration these days, and the labor outflow has stopped by large. So, Andris probably would like to say some additional words on this issue, but I would proceed with the domestic sources. And on the domestic side, at face value, you see that activity of the Latvian labor force is quite high. Actually, participation rate in the Baltic countries is among the highest in Europe, which means that our people are quite active, quite eager to work or either to look for the job, right? And it's not the situation as in many like southern countries where participation rates are low and the labor market is not active. So everything looks fine here, but looking deeper under the surface, we see that actually there are a lot of temporary factors that have actually set this broad picture. And namely, one large factor is demographic shift. So as the baby boomers of the 1980s entered the labor market and gradually became the prime age workforce in our case, this has significantly increased our participation rates. But further on, we see that the following cohorts, they are already much, much smaller in terms of number of people. And when those cohorts enter the labor market, this would bring down the participation rate, and we would move closer to the European average levels. And in the middle of next decades, the trend would reverse, namely the impact would be negative, right? We are on the top of the hill right now, and the way goes down, unfortunately, which means that the issues of labor shortage will become more pressing in the following years. So, about the domestic reserves, you saw that on the external side, a lot of labor available. We just need to be smart to utilize those opportunities, but also domestically. Well, headline unemployment rates have declines and possibly are not as large as they used to be in the post-crisis years. But if you look at the broader measures of unemployment, including also those people who are not looking for a job, but who would like to work if they had a chance, so then the broad unemployment rates are way higher. And in Latvia and Estonia, they still exceed 10%, which is really, really high. So, and this also suggests that we have labor reserve domestically, and we need to look into the ways how to activate those people and bring those people back into the labor market. And if you kind of try to understand what sustains these high structural unemployment rates, one of the major factors is skills mismatches. So basically, companies require from their employees particular skill sets, but then on the employees' sides, there are different skills, and those skills do not meet. So there is demand, there is supply that do not meet in the labor market. And you see quite close correlation between the labor market mismatch indexes and the size of the structural unemployment in the European countries. And unfortunately, in our case, structural unemployment is high and skills mismatches are high as well. And another issue is regional disparities. Unemployment levels among different regions within the Baltic countries differs quite significantly. And here you see unemployment, the difference in percentage points among the best performing and the worst performing regions in particular Baltic countries, and you see that the differences are quite striking. So both employment levels and unemployment rates within the countries differ significantly. Of course, I mean, I should mention that you cannot really directly compare the levels because the breakdown, the regional the regions differ. I mean, in Latvia, larger regions, in Estonia, are smaller regions. It's natural if you have more smaller regions, then the difference between employment and unemployment is stronger. But anyway, this suggests that the differences are quite significant. And this is also one of the sources why the aggregate unemployment rates are high. And overall, my colleagues have assessed, and actually you can have more detailed information in the discussion paper, which was written by my colleague Oļegs Krasnopjoros, and the paper was distributed at the registration desks. So there's more detail on the way we assessed these numbers. But generally our conclusion is that there's a large pool of available labor domestically, and you need to bring these people back into the labor market. Overall, it's ranging from 27,000 in Estonia up to 86,000 in Lithuania, which is 4 to 8% of the employment at the moment. So it's a significant number. And if you look on a more detailed level in the table, you can note several distinctive groups where employees are available, or in which groups the aggregate employment is below the levels we see in the best performing regional peers in the regional countries that are best performers in terms of the labor market. And one particular distinctive group is youth. Youth unemployment, basically low youth employment, is quite widespread in the Baltic countries. Then there's another Estonia-specific issue. Basically, it's women in the fertile age. I would not address this issue in, this is not a problem possibly, but this issue in more detail. Ulo might like to touch upon this issue, but I assume this is a price to pay for a brighter demographic future in Estonia. And then a large group, upper middle aged men, which consistently show way lower employment rates in the Baltic countries compared to the regional peers. So let's look into each of those large groups. So youth employment is low in the Baltics. At the same time, there is no kind of larger incidence of unemployment in the Baltic countries, basically, which means that youth is outside the labor market. Part probably is studying, which is good. Basically, they're acquiring skills to be better positioned on the labor markets in the future and to bring better value to the economy in the future. But again, devil is in the details. And looking into the details, it appears that in the Baltic countries, general or academic education is much more widespread than in the best performing regional peers in terms of the labor market outcomes. And you see that popularity of the vocational training is low, actually, in the Baltic countries, which means there is less apprentices. People are getting just general skills, which makes them worse positioned to get the first job, for example, and they stay out of the labor market for longer years. So possibly from a policy perspective, we need to kind of increase the popularity of the vocational training, improve the quality of the vocational training, and then bring more people into the vocational training so that they are better positioned to start work at an earlier age. Turning to the upper middle-aged men, and this is really a large group, so the time is running. And there, I would say, there are two problems. One problem is skills. That's why we see also the structural unemployment in the Baltics is high. Here I put digital skills that are systemically lower in the Baltics, especially for the older cohorts compared to the regional peers. And then there's a lifelong learning. Estonia is an exception in the lifelong learning. Estonia is doing quite well, actually even better than on average among regional peers, but then Latvia and Lithuania is lagging behind. And if you, would like to change your skills during your lifetime, during your career, you have to learn something, right? You have to be active into acquiring new skills. You have to participate in these lifelong learning programs on the one hand. On the other hand, state has to do something to supply those opportunities, to supply different education opportunities. And talking about the unemployed people, those who are registered unemployed, then the major policy lever on the government side is active labor market policy. And in our case, capacity, basically, of the labor market policy is quite low. On the funding side, we do not invest into this policy. Funding allocated for active labor market policy in Baltics is among the lowest in the European Union. And in Latvia in particular, we could also improve in terms of allocation of those funds. So basically, we invest a lot of money in providing kind of general courses, like short-term training, but then if you look at the performance of those who have undertaken these short-term courses, short-term learning programs, in terms of finding the job after being educated in this way, the probabilities are much smaller. And then when it comes to professional training and retraining, to the internships in the firms, support to start entrepreneurship, then of course the probabilities are much higher to find a job after kind of coming through these programs. Of course there's selection bias, probably only the best people go to those programs, but anyway, there is a lot of food for thought to consider this issue, to reallocate, to make this policy, the funds we have, kind of to allocate those funds in a more efficient way. So, and then another issue for the upper middle-aged men is their status of health, which is quite poor, actually. And here I put the self-assessment of the health, which clearly has something to do with our health policy, health availability, quality of the healthcare, but also the lifestyle. And if you look at the different lifestyle indicators, here is the kind of aerobic physical activity of the population, which is systemically below the average of the kind of best performing regional peers. You can look at the smoking, incidence of smoking among the population, many other indicators. I mean, lifestyle also matters, and this is an important issue. So health, in a broad sense, is another issue we have to address to make those persons really better positioned on the labor market. Looking into the future, another problem which was already outlined by the Bosch representative in the video, basically the labor code. So in practice, Baltics are famous for their flexible labor markets, but actually on paper, there are starking differences among the countries. You see that Estonia has really flexible labor code, not putting a lot of restrictions, but Latvia is on the other end. We have really strict employment protection legislation, and de facto labor market is flexible possibly because the judiciary system is not as efficient and it's quite costly, and in terms of I mean money and time to go to courts and to prove your rights, and your employer cannot kind of fire you, right? So basically labor probably is not doing that, and that's why de facto labor market is flexible. But as we catch up in terms of judicial capacity, this might become an increasing problem, and I think it's right time to discuss also these issues. And on the third broad direction, on basically on the capital and knowledge, and there are two broad kind of ways of action. One is replace, as I mentioned, replace labor with capital, basically automate, increase on automation investments, and another is accumulate knowledge, become smarter, and find the ways how to use your labor and your capital in a more efficient way. And on capital, of course, we still have a room to raise our capital per labor ratios, right? We've had quite strong convergence over the past year, and here you see the assessment of the Baltic capital levels compared to the German capital levels. And of course, this is an assessment, and you always have to take the capital level assessment with a grain of salt. But anyway, this shows you the trends, and this shows you that you still have potential, but possibly the low-hanging fruits here have been picked already. So you can grow by increasing your capital stock, but I mean it's becoming increasingly harder and harder to generate growth by just purely accumulate capital, which essentially means that to sustain further income convergence in the Baltic countries, you have to increasingly focus on accumulating knowledge and to find the ways how to use capital and labor in a more productive way. And here I put an example of the manufacturing, as there is data on disaggregated level. I could produce charts like this, and manufacturing is also a tradable sector, basically, which faces competition from the other countries, right? And it's very important to basically tradable sector is a kind of a driver of the economic development. And here I put sorry, where is the laser pointer? So these are subsectors of manufacturing, and I arranged those subsectors of manufacturing across the productivity levels, average productivity levels in the best performing European Union countries in terms of productivity, or basically in terms of the value added per employee. And it appears that pharmaceuticals, chemicals, like computer electrical equipment, transport machinery, also paper, are the most productive sectors. And here I put the labor allocation. Basically, the difference is between how much people work in these sectors in the Baltic countries and in the best performing European countries in terms of their productivity. And it appears that in the kind of highest productive sectors, there are fewer workers in Baltics. And our workers more concentrate in lower productive sectors. So basically, which means that we can become more efficient by reallocating labor across those sectors, by moving from these lower value-added sectors to higher value-added sectors. But this is not the whole story. The blue bars I put here represents our productivity as percent of the average European Union country best performers' productivity. And you see that in all sectors, our productivity levels, they differ from sector to sector, but the productivity level from the European productivity level is around 30%, which means that we have also plenty of space to raise productivities within sectors, within particular companies, by becoming smarter producers, by producing, goods that have higher value added, by producing goods that are kind of differentiated in a way that have knowledge, significant knowledge content into those goods, and that do not kind of face tough competition from low-cost producer countries, right? So basically, reallocation of labor and accumulation of knowledge are both quite important in our further income convergence process. And generally, to do that, to reallocate the labor and to become smarter, we need to have adequate knowledge. And here I put charts basically that shows a different kind of education outcome indicators. Generally, it's from OECD's PISA tests and from global competitiveness reports. And it turns out that if you compare with the best performers of the European Union, we are lagging behind on most of those indicators. Estonia is doing a bit better, and probably on quality of math and science and on digital skills even outperforming the average of EU best performers, but generally we are lagging behind. And this means that we have just an average starting position in this further qualitatively different convergence process. But the good thing is that in this particular sector we have a lot of low-hanging fruits, which means that we might get a decent return on investments in our education and research sectors. So we just have to shape our policies and make smart investments into these sectors, and then everything will be okay. So main takeaways, and there's just 3 points, as I assume I already have exceeded my time allocated for my speech. So labor shortage is here to stay if left unaddressed. Basically, we have a lot of structural factors driving that, and if we do nothing, the situation will stay the same for many, many years. So, of course, as I mentioned, the easy way to solve the problem is to bring in the people from the third countries, and plenty of opportunities there, but then activating domestic labor reserves may be quite costly. But not doing that would be penny wise, pound foolish. So we have these people that are out of the labor markets in our countries, and those people would stay there for many, many years. And if they are not employed, if they are not in the labor markets, they would have to stay in the social safety nets. And to keep them in social safety nets permanently, that would cost a fortune. I mean, probably it's costly, but it would be a smart investment to bring those people back into the labor market. And then the final takeaway that raising human capital is probably key to further income convergence in the Baltic countries, and it would help in also in alleviating the labor market pressures in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Uldis. Thank you very much for very broad, please come, yeah, very broad kind of set out of the Baltic situation. I would just add to the last point, it can also be interpreted in a way that in terms of the measures taken, we have not been that successful so far, you know, to alleviate these problems from structural point of view. Unfortunately, no questions at this moment because you really kind of, we're running out of time. So let me move to Ilo. What's going on in Estonia? How do you see this problem from the Estonian perspective? And if you could pay, you know, a bit more attention to issues such as how come that your lifelong learning is so much better than the other two Baltic countries? What have you done? You know, is that the Finnish experience that you've just, you know, imported across the sea, or is that something homemade? Another thing is also immigration issues and reservation wage, you know, people coming back, you getting people from the third countries in as well. In the Latvian situation, we have not had that much of a success story in terms of migration flows. Could you please touch upon these as well?
Okay, thank you. And thank you first for the Bank of Latvia to organize the conference, and congratulations to the bank and Governor Rimšēvičs to organizing that for quite some time now. And I really have an honor
16th year.
16th
this is
year.
the 16th year.
And it's an honor to be here, and thank you for asking me here. But I will try to give you a bit of views from the Estonian side, especially from the macro point of view as well. I'm more to the macroeconomist, and I'm not sure that I'm very good in the educational system parts.
But you're doing better, but better than the other two.
But I tried to answer what you are asking at. But first, let me touch upon what we have seen in Estonian case past maybe 4 or 5 years now, is the fact that yes, there has been a clear change in the trends, meaning that we are seeing that migration, which is this outflow of people, has turned around, so we are now seeing clearly inflow of people. So at first we started to see people, kind of quite a lot of those who have emigrated are kind of coming back, so it has kind of positively impacted that. And the other part, of course, is the fact that now we do see also kind of a wave of immigration from the third countries. But if we look at that, whether this is kind of a structural development or whether it's just a cyclical development, then I have to say it's probably both at the moment. So it's, yes, as Uldis showed, actually, if you look at the Estonian demographic situation, then it has been okay so far, but at least in the future, we do see that the demographic tendencies tend to show that our working age population will decrease. And actually, the labor market has proved to be more successful than we have thought in the bank, at least, that this domestic number of people who are working are increasing much more than what we had in mind maybe 5 years ago. But of course, the labor market also, there is a need for them, because especially the young cohorts which are entering the market are small, but especially the new IT skills are needed quite a lot in the IT sector and startup businesses, which is quite growing fast in Estonia, and that's why they need definitely the structural need for this high qualified labor to that sectors. From the other part, of course, we have seen kind of quite fast growth rates now in the economy, and especially in the construction sector and other sectors, and fast wage growth in the economy, and that has kind of firstly meant that there is a kind of a need to have foreign labor if you want to expand your businesses. And the other part, of course, is that there is a cost factor, that companies are searching for cheaper labor. And that's why we have basically, so I would say, seen a kind of increase in this foreign labor. But if we are tackling this labor shortages, I would say that there are this kind of two aspects, I think, what we have seen in Estonia, what we have done. First, of course, as Uldis said, that there is kind of this tap reserves in the country. We have had this workability program, so where there's a considerable amount of people in Estonia which have registered themselves as partially or totally not able to work for different medical reasons. But then this partial ability to work now, if you want to get the subsidies, you need to participate in the labor market as well, otherwise you don't get them. And that has been quite successful at this pushing more the people to the...
And that happened a couple of years ago, I understand.
That happened, yes, now three years, I think.
So there's a good kind of track record to say that it did work, that was a good choice.
At least in a sense, I'm not in a position to say that whether the whole amount of money which has been spent there has been efficient, but at least in a sense that we have get more people into the labor market, yes, that has been a success story. And of course we have changed some other parts of that as well. Actually, Unemployment Insurance Board has been given a task to engage in more offering training. That's probably this part of this lifelong learning actually part as well. These vocational training centers are more and more actually for this lifelong learning perspectives as well. People go to have new skills if they are searching for new opportunities in the labor markets. So this has been kind of quite active and I think has been quite successful. But regarding the migration part, I think we have quite strict rules actually officially, that there is only 0.1% of the population are allowed to give out these living permits to the third countries. So it's 1,300 per year, a year. And I think this year we made a record that I think it was in the very beginning of January when this already was fulfilled. So it's basically clear that, okay, that's not enough what the economy needs. And now we have quite a lot of exceptions to that rule. Basically, you have relaxed the rules quite a lot. So the rule is still there, but of course, if you are an IT specialist, then you don't need to apply the rules, and etc. And on top of that, we have this so-called short-term worker registration program, where you have this temporary living permits, or they are these kind of long-term visas actually what they are giving. So out of 15 months, you can 12 months be in Estonia and work. And that has been very heavily used now, especially by the Ukrainians. But I'm not sure that how much that is the pull factor and how much is the push factor actually. That could be also that you start to see that from Ukraine actually there is a wave outward migration. It's not only Estonia. In Poland there are millions of Ukrainians now working. So
but if you would give kind of a number of total kind of immigrants working in the labor market, what's the percentage?
I think that's just in past 2 years, I would say it's around 5% of the.
So 5%.
It could be 3 to 5% because we don't have the exact figures because it's difficult to estimate because there are some of them are not registered at all.
Well, that's quite sizable, 5%, if we agree with the number. 5% of those employed being on short-term contracts from outside. That is quite a sizable impact.
That's true. But of course, we have to keep in mind that. Especially that, as also Uldis showed, that there are some problems in the Estonian labor market as well. That we have some regions where there are problems like northeastern part in Estonia. The unemployment rate is much higher. There is not that much mobility inside Estonia actually. So those people are not moving to the parts where there is a lot of work. There is still this non-Estonians, especially those who don't speak Estonian language. They are much more restricted in the labor market, so there is of course, and of course if you have a migration wave coming in, then of course those parts of the society are putting much more pressure now on as well. And of course, if we are thinking of those like a kind of a temporary phenomenon, but of course we know from the history that it could not be so. So it's always the question that how temporary it is, whether the business models of the companies are such now that they actually need these temporary workers for a longer time in order to be competitive in the international market. So but for me, it's clear that, of course, from the cost-wise, we are going to see continued increase in the costs, in the wages, in all of the wages.
Can we touch upon those wages and kind of type of reservation wage argument? Is that an interesting thing was that reaching some income level, it seemed that it started pulling back people. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, it is difficult to estimate one. But especially if you look at this on average wages, then it's extremely difficult. But if you look at this kind of different distributions of wages, then actually in Tallinn area, the capital area, then the wages are much higher than on average in Estonia. And then, of course, I think when they have reached a certain level compared to what people can earn in Helsinki, which is only 80 kilometers away, then of course there has been a change in this behavior that people, rather than commute, they stay in Estonia. And clearly there are evidence that in some sectors wages have already converged. For example, in IT sector, in several companies the wages are pretty much the same as in Helsinki. So that's why some sectors in Estonia are already attractive for the internationals in that sense.
Thank you, Ulo. As to what is going to be done in the future, we'll come back in the second round. I hope we'll have time for that. Borja, you coming from an international institution, so you have a broad view on the global trends as well, but you run the mission to Lithuania. So how does Lithuanian labor market look like? And what about this productivity wage gap? Do we see any major problems there?
So, well, thank you. Let me take first a bit of perspective of how convergence has taken place in the region, comparing it to the most successful cases in Asia, for example, Korea. From a quantitative point of view, and until the global financial crisis, you have that convergence, the speed of convergence in Europe, Eastern Europe and the Baltics, has been more or less comparable to the best successful cases in the past. But qualitatively, it has been very different. In Europe, it has been driven by total factor productivity to a much larger extent than in Asia. With labor contribution here having been negative, population in the last 20 years, for example, in Lithuania, has fallen by 20%. And capital accumulation has also been weaker, driven by low domestic savings, in part because there has been financial deepening rather than financial repression. So households in the region have been able, anticipating future higher income, to increase consumption. So you've relied too much on foreign savings for investment and not on domestic savings. So this was quantitatively, again, a very successful story. Now, the problem now is the future is a bit more challenging because total factor productivity has fallen, has halved in the region or across the world, but has halved in the region after the global financial crisis. And that was your main driver of convergence. We still keep projecting demographic dynamics to be negative. Time will tell, and you were just talking about some changes recently that suggest that we may be a bit too pessimistic. Savings have increased, and that will support probably a slightly higher capital accumulation, or at least less dependency on foreign savings. So the question is, how will success come? And let me first talk about how will success look like. And you've also touched on this in the previous presentations. Success will inevitably require high, sustained wage growth going forward. There is no other way you can change, revert demographic, attract back workers that left. And for that, you need productivity growth. If for wages to be sustainably high, you need productivity.
So in short, what you're saying, of course, if we disregard what we saw in 2005, 6, 7, when the wage growth was in excess of 30, 40% per annum, but at the moment, what we see, the wage growth, in the range of 8, 9%, of course, it is very fast, but perhaps we should view this from the perspective, it's not that wage growth is too fast, but the problem is that the productivity growth is too slow. Is that right?
With some caveats.
Okay.
So I think a key component for that to be the case going forward is to maintain the labor market flexibility you have in these countries, particularly because that implies that the wage setting is done at the firm level to a large extent, and that means that productivity and wages will be relatively closely linked. Now, am I concerned about high wage growth observed in the last 3 or 4 years when I say that that's what we need to see for a successful convergence going forward? Let me, economists are always on the one hand and on the other, and if you are an IMF economist, risks are paramount in our, so let me be an uncharacteristically blunt in this, and I say I'm not concerned, for 2 reasons. One is what we are observing.
That is quite a statement.
Yes, please. So let me try to justify it. From what we are, what we are observing is not necessarily contradicting the theory. You are a convergence economy, and if you think of Balassa-Samuelson, and there was some in the presentations before, there was some graphs where you distinguish tradables and non-tradables. In a very simplistic way, tradables and the profitability of the tradable sector is supported by wage growth. Not every year, but if you have some perspective, over time, productivity in the manufacturing, the tradable sector has been very high and in line, if not exceeding, wage growth.
That's for all 3 Baltic countries or specific?
Well, that's where I was going to be back to. No. That's a good question because I was blunt. Now I'm going to be back an IMF economist and take a bit more of a cautious view. That, if you look at Estonia, is basically at the last 20 years, both have gone hand in hand in the manufacturing and the exporting sector. If you look at Lithuania, has been overperforming. So productivity over the last 20 years has been significantly higher in the manufacturing sector than wage growth. Again, not year by year, but if you look at you get some perspective. In Latvia, that is not the case, especially in the last 3 years. So productivity and wages in the manufacturing sector were more or less hand in hand until 3 years ago, where wages are exceeding productivity. Now, the counterpart of that is the non-tradable sector. And we would expect...
So domestic sector, by and large.
Yes, services, let's think of services, for example. We would expect wages to equalize across sectors, and that's something that you broadly observe in the 3 Baltic economies. And those services are less productive. And therefore, you would expect that wages in services are not necessarily hand in hand with productivity. But there again, you see that in Estonia, for example, that it's, again, over the last 20 years on average, productivity in the non-tradable sector is slightly below wage growth. In Lithuania, and again, it's a bit of an overperformer there, it's in line, actually, not below. And in Latvia, it's below. So that, if you think of this on average, then you can have a situation where, on average, you have high wage growth because wages are growing high on both sectors of the economy. Relatively low productivity, but high productivity where you need to be competitive in your exporting sectors. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily imply that your competitiveness, your external competitiveness, is going to be affected if, in the manufacturing sector, there is not those discrepancies. There is a second reason why I'm not concerned, and I'll finish soon. I'll try to stick to my 5 minutes.
I have another question still kind of lingering up in the air stuff, yeah? Sure.
And it's that wages, because of the flexibility of the labor market, wages in the Baltics act as a self-correcting mechanism. So even if, or when...
But that's a painful one.
Well, it's the alternative, I think it's more painful.
Okay.
So even when productivity lacks wage growth, for example, particularly in the export sector, and eventually that affects competitiveness and therefore employment, and unemployment starts to increase, wages respond. So the sensitivity of wages to unemployment is very high. And if you compare that to the peripheral European economies, Greece, Italy, Spain, and even Ireland, it's much higher. Okay. And so its wages act as a self-correcting mechanism. Now, it can be painful because the crisis can be deep, but it's also the positive side of that is that the rebound is also very dramatic.
Yeah.
So
okay, that's in a way kind of good news as well. So if there are excesses, they manage to correct themselves quite quickly.
Let me just finish with one small thing. So I think on the macro, and we can get in more details, but the labor market looks fine at the macro level. Maybe it's at the micro and mismatching and all the other issues that were brought up in the presentation before that the focus should be.
But So what you're saying, those social issues are very important. What happens with unemployed? Can they be pulled back into the labor market? And how the people already being employed can keep increasing their productivity.
Exactly.
Okay. Then, being a Latvian, okay, I have a question. If you take a look at the Baltic countries, and you're covering Lithuania, maybe you have the kind of the answer to the question that we are struggling, economists at least, and policymakers, with over the last 10 years, is that Lithuanians have managed to catch up with Estonians in terms of purchasing power parity adjusted income per capita, okay? And even kind of overtaken, perhaps a bit, Estonians. But Latvians have not managed that. What is the success story? What are the reasons for the success story of the Lithuanian economy? Is this also to do with the labor market that you mentioned, that productivity growth has been faster than wage growth, or is there something else that we should take into account?
Well, I think you saw in the figure before that whereas labor markets are very flexible in the three economies, there are some rigidities. Yeah. That figure was on average, I think it went on the rigidity side up to 2015. Since then, for example, Lithuania has approved a labor code that dealt with actually some of those rigidities, redundancy costs, type of labor contracts, things like that. So if anything, it's moved to the flexibility side also on that aspect. I think on the macro level, there are also other reasons why Latvia might have been. First, I think it's in relative terms. I think the three Baltics are a success story in terms of convergence. Thank you. So, but I think we need to keep that perspective.
But we can do better.
Things could be better, but they could also be much worse. So I think we shouldn't.
It's not the option we want to consider.
But we shouldn't lose that perspective. Because sometimes solutions are more problematic than. But if you look, for example, at the boom-bust period, it is true that the three countries went over a boom and a bust. But Latvia, it was higher. So when current account deficits in Estonia and Lithuania were 15% of GDP, in Latvia it was 20%.
25.
Wage growth was much higher in Latvia than in Estonia and Lithuania. If you look at total debt of the economy, the four sectors of the economy, in Lithuania it was in 2009 around 130. In Latvia it was 240% of GDP. And Estonia was in the middle. So imbalances have been more, have been higher in Latvia. For example, one very different performance households during the boom periods. In Lithuania, really, the household sector did not join the party until the very end. And so the leverage of the household sector was relatively low. Whereas in Latvia and in Estonia were relatively high. So the deleverage, for example, of the household sector has taken place in the three countries, but in Lithuania it has been very moderate because it was relatively low to start with. So there are aspects that in Lithuania maybe they have managed to get a more moderate cycles. And that is
so
very
less
important.
volatility, more consistent growth. Thank you. With this one, I'll go to Andris. You know, you facing these kind of labor market issues on a daily basis. That's a matter of your company, you know, being profitable, you know, being competitive. How do you view the labor market trends? What about, you know, this business cycle volatility, for instance, that was mentioned just now by Borja? What about, you know, skills? You know, do you have the skills? And I know that your company has automated lots of tasks.
This really escapes me through two crises in 2009 and 2016 here in Latvia. But let's see. When we start our business, it was in 2001 when we started thinking about that time.
And your business is construction sector related?
No, not construction sector. We are producers. We're producing for construction sector.
No, but I said construction sector related.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And that time we already understood that tomorrow the wage or salaries will be higher, like today. And after tomorrow will be again higher. And we will be, in a couple of years, we will be participate European Union. And we will be into the Eurozone. And if you already know this, you must be ready for that in your plans, in your investments. Because if you will not to calculate about that, then you will be out of range. Because your biggest competitors are global companies in Baltic and in Scandinavia. And for that, what we did already to put how much automatic things we can into our plans. Secondly, about, let's say, The problem, what we didn't mention, it was this economical crash. Crash minus GDP minus 18 point something % in each of our countries. And it really, I think that nobody can manage like this crashing. Okay, maybe -5, but was...
Yeah, because you have business in all 3 Baltic countries,
yes,
so you can
yes,
compare that.
Yes,
yeah.
And, okay, but because of our credit and because of our small amount of employees, we survive.
How many employees do you have?
We are the biggest producer in each country and biggest market share. Can you imagine how many?
I know. I've checked that out. You have
including
four
me, who not working today, but sitting here, it's 158.
158
yes. And
across
6 in one shift. 6 in one shift.
6 people in one shift.
Yeah,
okay.
And it's a little bit too much.
And being the market leader. Okay.
It's too much. We know some things, but we must invest. Okay. But for my problem is in Baltic countries is this go up and down, going up and down. All speakers and figures show that those countries, for example, Estonia or Lithuania, who manage from government side manage these economical cycles, they live already better. Because, you know, I don't know how you're working, but in my house, we need capex for 5 years. We need budget for 5 years. We are on the process again for 5 years, more every year. And and because of this budget, because of this capex, you can calculate it, what you will do, and you must think what will happen in economies. In our economy, real Baltic country, because I cannot just, if Latvia crash down again, then I cannot all my bags send to Stockholm and be happy. It's impossible, unfortunately. I must do something else. But if I calculated that the government have analytics center, Minister of Economics, they have analytics center who every day check out economical numbers, figures, what's going on private consumption, what's going on, what will be private consumption in 2 years, in 3 years, and they have in other pockets, they have a capex, an investment plan, what they will do in infrastructure for those moments when private consumption drop down. We don't know why. This is the biggest problem that I have today.
So,
but about, I write some things here. But about what is my problem, or problems of guys who is more close to 50 years old, who works in same industry more of 20 years, and who studying in that time, like me, when was no any lessons about economy or not any lessons about PR and marketing. Did we, when we was last time in our alma mater? When? 10 years ago? 20 years ago? Secondly, how often we send our 57 employees, except me, back to the school. How many times we invite professors of our alma maters, come to our plant, please check out, maybe I do something wrong. And last is this digital transformation. Do you use really newest management models in your plants? How you communicate with your employees into the Estonia, Latvia, and the guys who in branch in Finland who sells my products there? Did you use all the newest things, or you fly there, or how you do this? And I think this is more important, also problem in my side, on entrepreneur side, how modern we are, how often we use how often we read books.
Okay, this is fantastic, because typically what you would expect, in a way, okay, well, taxes are too high, we should reduce the taxes, then, oh, what else?
No problem,
you know,
about
this
taxes.
and that and that. So at the end,
restrictions on
yeah, too much restrictions, you know, too strict labor code and all these kind of things. So what you're in fact saying is that, of course, perhaps these issues may be and are of importance, but the most important ones is what we do with our business if we run a company, what we do with our own skills, and that we train for the needs of the market, not when we are unemployed. Hopefully we do that if it comes, but we do these things all the time. Thank you, Andris. And now coming to Evita, you know, what we've heard is what the situation looks like, you know, what the academics think could be done, and then what the real life businessmen do. What's the role of the authorities here? How do the authorities see this situation? What is on your plate? What are you gonna do with that?
Yeah. We from our side, from side of state employment agencies, see the couple of major challenges what should be solved in this time or so. But I will say, to be honest, it was mentioned in previous presentations, and previous speakers pointed out already that. But I will say. Yeah, I will show you the map of Latvia, but...
Could we have the slide,
okay,
please?
Yeah. And I will show that map to better illustrate how different the situation are in Latvia between the regions. And if we can, if we see in Riga or Riga region that unemployment rate is little bit higher than 3%, but in Latgale is still...
So in Riga, virtually no unemployment.
Yes, and our clients in Riga every day changing, and we have abundance of vacancies, but in Latgale region we have still high unemployment rate and no vacancies and no possible jobs in that region. And what I will say is that the regional mobility or domestic mobility or mobility inside the country is one of the main challenge and at the same time main opportunity for us to how to motivate our people to go.
Do you see, sorry to kind of interrupt, but do you see that people want to move? Do you see that they understand that they need to move regionally? And do you help that if they?
We try to help them, but what do we see? We see that our people are not motivated to move. They will stay in their houses, their places where they was born, and so on. And since 2013, we offered the financial support for those ones who will be regionally mobile, to help them or compensate the expenses for commuting or
But it's only a couple of hundred or so that have used, or what's the outcome of that?
The main reason for that benefit is to help to start to this job a little bit farther from home, and when the situation was stabilized, then we hope that.
But the uptake, I understand, has been quite weak. Am I right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and we still promote this this option for our clients. The regional mobility is the one of the main challenge and opportunity at the same time. The second one, the skills, the appropriate or right skills, how to help our clients to be upskilled and reskilled in appropriate time. And the lifelong learning, which was mentioned before, and from Andris as well, how to motivate not only unemployed people, but employed people and employers to support workers' lifelong learning activities.
Can I show another slide? Sorry, just to the slide that I wanted to show about the poll in terms of what do people think, can they get a good job? Yeah, kind of. If we may look at this one, just to kind of target your question a bit more directly. One thing is, of course, what this employment agency supplies to the market as part of the life of kind of long learning program. But if you take a look currently, for instance, at the opinion poll, asking, to be precise, what are the current opportunities to find a good job in Latvia? And we see that only with the labor market, you know, quite hot, unemployment in Riga, as we saw, you know, by and large non-existent, we see that only 3% of people say that, you know, probability to find a good job is very low. You know, it's only 3%, then somewhat good 13%, and more than 50% in these labor market conditions still say that there is no chance to get a good job. What is the reason? Do they understand that they need to take those life kind of long learning things on board, or they wait for being unemployed? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a very big question about the skills mismatch, about the skills what will be need in labor market, and those skills what people have.
But unfortunately, this picture shows that people don't think like that. They think that their skills are fine. The problem is lack of good jobs. You know, but the businesses are saying, you know, there are lots of jobs but not good skills. What do we do about it?
Yeah, but I think nobody will say, I am not relevant for the job offers. Yeah. It's better to say, I can't find a good job. Okay. I think that, and if we talk about the skills, and when we today we can't say what the skills will be need after 5 years, and what we should learn, or what should propose to. And I will say the key skill today is ability to learn new skills every time, and be fit for that. And the one more thing from our point of view is we must move from cooperation between the stakeholders or actors in labor market to real partnerships, because not one institution, not one municipality, not one NGO or someone else can't solve this today's labor market issues by themselves, but it must be multiple team and work really together to find the best solutions for labor market.
Thank you. So, again, no silver bullet, only complex solutions. Yeah. Let me open up for the questions from the floor. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and the mic will be passed on to you. While this is happening, let me ask the question from Slido. I don't know which one to pick, all seem to be interesting. Let's do the second one. Is the answer really to promote vocational training, as Uldis said, if the skills that are essential... Oh, where did this disappear? Could we... okay. If the skills that are essential to future jobs are actually the softer skills. Could we please comment, Uldis? Yeah.
Yes, that's actually a very good question, and essentially it's true that the kind of this type of vocational training, manual labor, could be automated already these days, and probably those workers are the ones who are going to lose jobs when companies are increasing their automation investments in the Baltic countries. But I mean, it's not that easy. Of course, I mean, the demand for hardware versus soft skills changes, but for example, when it comes to vocational training, you can train a welder, for example, or you can train an operator of the automated welding machine. I mean, it's a question of how do you design your vocational training programs. And clearly we saw from the statistics that probability to find a job if you undertake in the vocational training program is higher than the probability if you have undertaken some short-term training and acquiring some soft skills. That's at the moment here. As we saw from the Andrea's presentation, we still have a way to go to reach the automation levels that are persisting now in Scandinavian countries, right? It would take time, and in the labor economics, there is a concept of hysteresis, basically, which means the longer you're out of the labor market, the harder it is to get back into the employment, right? And if there's demand for people with particular skills that can be obtained in the vocational training, I mean, you should invest in those training programs. Of course, you should also plan for the future, right, and try to find out how the demand would change in the future. But I mean, if you have a lot of people outside the labor market and you have demand for particular skills, I mean, that's no-brainer. You should invest into those training programs.
So in short, what you're saying, if I interpret from a different view, is that in a way, automation will be, will happen. It will be kind of dependent upon our success, because many things are not automated at the moment because labor costs in some areas are still quite low. If we are successful, and hope we are, to move the income levels up, to move wages up, those lower, cost jobs at the moment in the future will be automated. Okay? And then, of course, the question is, what do these people do? Do they have adequate skills? So again, another, factor showing that vocational training is very,
and if
very
I
important.
may adjust another thing on the training. So basically, there is this active labor market policy that is focusing on the unemployed, actually on the registered unemployed persons. Then there are some lifelong learning programs. Basically, employed persons can apply for the program and get some education. I've checked those programs, and my conclusion was that a lot of those training courses just overlap. We teach the same things to the unemployed people. We teach the same things that are people into the employment, and these things overlap. If you look at the average unemployed profile, it's really a person with basic education, really low levels of skills. And presumably the skill set and skill level of the employed persons is higher. So probably we should aim for some synergies in kind of arranging those different policies in a way that by providing training to already employed persons, you kind of increase the chance that they move up their careers and free up space for those who are unemployed and whose skills are really low. And obviously you cannot really provide top-notch skills to persons who have really low education levels. It takes time, it takes a lot of investments, right? And probably it would be wise to plan the programs so that, I mean, to have synergies between them. And then there is also another, there's some gap in the training, basically. There are people that are neither employed nor unemployed. They're inactive. They're outside of the labor market. But if they had a chance, they would take a job. I mean, and you should also target that part of the population.
But many of them think most likely that there are no good jobs. The reservation wage is too low for them. So again, it kind of takes two to tango. Do we have any question from yes, please. Could you please introduce yourself? And
Okay, I will try. I'm from the Ministry of Welfare.
Okay.
So that's the authorities that I refer to. And in my other capacity, I'm dealing with the economic governance of the European Union in the employment field. Okay. So one thing that I wanted to mention is that I understand that the OECD probably didn't have enough time for their presentation. But if they had, they probably would have kind of presented as well some slides of their impact evaluation of our policies that show that the outcomes are quite good. And on the other questions that I wanted to ask is on this skills mismatches and skills shortages. So just some months ago, I chaired a meeting of EU member states on this particular topic. And it seemed that Latvia is not among the countries that are on the top with this challenge. There are other countries in the European Union, like the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Estonia was mentioned there, as well as that face particular labor market, kind of those shortages. My question, however, relates to this statement that we have very big skills issues in Latvia. Here the question is, why then the unemployment levels in Riga and Valmiera are so low, if indeed this is about skills that are, that is the reason for the structural component in unemployment?
Okay.
Is it not more about regional differences than about skills? Thank you.
Andrea, would you like to comment on the, or no? Okay. I had to ask, you know. The panel, do you see that you can comment anything on these issues? Please, yes, please.
So on Lithuania last year, we focused on the issue of skill mismatch and active labor market policies. There are different definitions and ways of looking at mismatching. The OECD has some indices looking at on-the-job mismatching, and there the Baltics don't do necessarily, I mean, they are more or less on average with the OECD. They are not doing particularly bad, but not doing particularly well. If you look at other more aggregate measures of mismatch by skill level, what we observed was that during the crisis, these measures, which is a relative measure, but still increased in the sense, shot up, basically, and particularly in Latvia and Lithuania, not so much in Estonia, and they still remain above pre-crisis levels. And what is this? This is looking at what the labor market demands in terms of the skills composition, low, medium, and high skills, and what the labor force supplies. And so there is an oversupply of low-skilled labor and an under
And it may have a regional dimension as well.
It will have, but when we look at active labor market policies, and it's not the same across all the Baltics in the same way, but first we see that they are relatively small in size. In Lithuania, at least, they depended too much. They depend almost exclusively their funding on EU funds. So the funding is not flexible and not depending on labor market conditions. And it's mostly focused, or largely focused, on subsidies rather than training programs. Now, the subsidies don't necessarily go to the main issue here, which is you need to increase the skills of the labor force because there is an supply of high-skilled workers, where they just try to match the gap between the productivity of the worker and the minimum wage that the firm has to pay them. So the OECD has a lot of very detailed recommendations on how to improve the active labor market policy programs in terms of training and all that. We also think that maybe, and again, there are limited resources, but the envelope is relatively low, and the emphasis should be more on training than on subsidies or direct employment.
Thank you. We unfortunately have run out of time, long time ago, but we'll try to squeeze into 3 more minutes. So there's the last question from the floor. Could you please be very brief and right to the point?
I'll be very brief. My name is Florian. I worked in the last 5 years in a vocational project in Latvia, and I want to focus a bit on this mismatch of skills. So if we ask for the root cause, isn't it that there is, if you go into the vocational training system, it is at the moment school-based, and you have a practical percentage of less than 10%. It's usually an internship at the end of a 3-year or 4 years schooled kind of training of 2 weeks. And that's why you end up not producing skills. And the question also suggests that you can produce soft skills in more academic environments. I don't think that that is true, because at a university you don't learn skills. You learn maybe knowledge or how to learn, but no skills. So what is needed is to bring the private sector into vocational training. Yeah, and
okay, so that's
participate.
So what's the question?
Companies actually that it is what we call a dual approach, that it's shared between a school approach and the companies, because the only place where you can learn skills is while working.
Yeah, yeah. Sure, but this is what we already tried to cover. Okay, let me take the question. I think this one is an interesting one. How would the reallocation of labor to high value-added sectors happen in practice? You know, government managing the economy, or what are the opportunities here? Please.
I think what you can see in Estonian case, what we have seen some of the shift in the, basically what you mean here is how the structure of the economy will change in the future.
Exactly.
And it's definitely, I think the cost push factors are here quite a big and important one. So meaning that if the companies, like Andrea said, that are taking in their plans that, okay, the wages are going to increase for the next 5 years, and I make my plans according to that, this means that he has to raise his productivity in his company at the same pace. So it does not mean exactly that you have to change the people from one company to another, but the company itself may change and become a more value-added company. And I think that this wage pressure for the company side is a quite important factor here as well.
Thank you. Unfortunately, there are lots of questions still around, like what to do with minimum wage, for instance, and all these kind of things. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time for that, but I would like to ask all panelists, you have 20 seconds each to answer what you think is the major thing to be done in the labor market. What is the most important thing, one sole important thing that you would do to improve the current situation of the labor market?
Stability. Stability. Stability for that people can, they already move from Latgale to Riga because they will keep the job in Riga or in Liepāja for next 5 years. I am ready to move. Why from Latvia move out to Ireland or to England or to Scandinavia? Because they know that for the next 5 years they really will work there. And if they will work good, and then this boss of that company will cut them and put into the new level, and he will earn more money. I think it's the word is stability, keyword.
Thank you.
I would like to say partnership. To achieve this goal or this to work together, and I think it's
okay. So business closer together with the authorities.
I think it's a business, it's municipalities, it's state institutions. Yeah,
cooperation.
I think we should move from just cooperation to partnership, where everyone have responsibility as well.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Borja.
I'm going to go back to the macro end, and I think to preserve macroeconomic stability and financial stability and predictability, and I'm going back to for that, you need to preserve labor market flexibility. You need to keep fiscal policies in the Baltics and macroprudential policies proactive, countercyclical. Those are the only buffers you have. You're a small open economy subject to all kind of external shocks. And I think, very importantly, to move away from the model of boom-bust cycles. And I have just to end on a positive. I think for the first time we are observing in all the Baltic countries that the recovery and expansion this cycle is without creating imbalances. And one statistic that I think shows that is if you look at employment in construction, for example, in Lithuania, 80% of construction employment in the boom, 80% of all employment was created in construction in the boom. All of that was destroyed in the bust. Since then, in the recovery in the last 8 years, only 10% of construction employment has reached the share of total.
Thank you. So again, kind of forward-looking things. Okay, kind of. Ulo, please.
Thank you, and yeah, it's good to put on my Fiscal Discipline Council hat here and say that actually I'm just glad to hear what also the private sector is saying, that actually you need this kind of counter-cyclical fiscal policies in order to have buffers in the fiscal policy to make sure that if the shock comes on, you can react. And unfortunately, we have seen, I think, both in my country and also in Latvia, that actually the fiscal policies are not as prudent as they should be, and they are not ready for the next crisis, I have to say. It's clear. From the labor market part, I think what also is important, I think, is both from the people side and from the company side to put more emphasis on the productivity increases, and that's meaning that the changes both in skills and both in this kind of how the production is actually organized. So those both are, and the management skills, and so these are very important.
Uldis?
Yes, I would invest in education, basically to increase quality of education and to bring more people into the college-type education as opposed to the academic education. As the gentleman mentioned, basically the skills are that matter on the labor market, and it's a college-type education that provides you skills so that you are suited to enter the labor market.
Approaching the group of 50 and above, I think the health issue is important as well, because if you take a look at the healthy years of life, the average for 50 years old men is only 10 years. You know, the retirement starts at the moment at 64, you know, something. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, we run over time.